The first time I noticed something wrong was when I saw tire marks leading straight to the waterline behind my lake house marks that didn't belong to me, or my guests, or anyone who should have been on my private land. I followed them with a strange pit in my stomach, stepping past the weeping willows and wild grass that had lined my lakefront since the day I bought the place. It had been a peaceful sanctuary for years, mine and mine alone, and I knew every inch of that shoreline. But that morning, something was different. There were folding chairs set up. A small aluminum dock had been dragged halfway into the water, and someone had left a plastic cooler behind, half full of melted ice and a few cheap beers. That's when I saw her, the one woman I wished I'd never let near my property line. Karen R. Madison, self-appointed queen of the HOA and the bane of every neighbour's existence. She stood there in a wide-brimmed hat and oversized sunglasses, pointing around like a real estate agent at an open house, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that always seemed to mask poison. "This area is so much better open to the community," she told a family that had no idea they were trespassing. "We finally got access approved." I froze. Access approved? By who? I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't sold anything. The deed was still in my name Alonand. It extended all the way to the waterline, a hard-earned privilege that had cost me more than just money. I marched up, my boots crunching over the gravel path that ran beside the trees. "Karen," I said. "What the hell is going on?" She turned, plastering on a smile like I was just another HOA meeting she'd graciously allowed herself to attend. "Oh," she said, "didn't you get the notice? The board approved lakefront access for the community along this edge. We're turning it into a shared launch point." My blood ran cold. "You mean my property?" I asked. "The lakefront I own? The land that's fenced and registered and very clearly marked in the county survey as private use?" Karen didn't flinch. "Technically, your lot lines are being reviewed. And since the HOA owns the easement behind your fence, we've decided it's better for the greater good. Besides, you weren't using it." That was the beginning. The spark. The moment the fuse was lit. What followed was a spiral of legal maneuvering, deceit, and public humiliation that I wasn't ready for but should have been. Because Karen wasn't just your average HOA busybody. She was connected. To city officials, to the assessor's office, even to the real estate lobby. And somehow, without notifying me through any proper channel, she had gotten the HOA to reinterpret the land records in a way that temporarily placed the lakefront under community recreational PRA. Designation? Whatever that meant. She had gone around me, taken my silence during an out-of-state work trip as an opportunity, and hosted a vote I was never informed of. But worse than that, she had used my land to host
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
But worse than that, she had used my land to host weekend gatherings, boat launches, and cookouts for her friends. Photos were already floating online, smiling families using my dock, kids swimming just feet from my deck. All without my knowledge. All without my permission. I started digging deep. I pulled the plat maps, the zoning codes, the deed copies. I spoke to 3 attorneys, 2 land surveyors, and even hired a drone operator to gather overhead footage of the fence line and shoreline. Everything checked out. Legally, I was still the owner. But what Karen had done was manipulate the perception of ownership. She'd created a paper trail suggesting ambiguity, and then leaned on her allies in the HOA to pass temporary access provisions while a review was conducted. The review? It didn't exist. It was a smokescreen, a stall tactic. And while I fought to regain control, she made herself look like a champion of the community. The public was on her sid until I found the email. It came through a misdirected server forwarding loop from a disgruntled ex-HOA secretary, a thread between Karen and the HOA treasurer. The subject line, "Push him out." Inside, proof that she had intentionally moved for a vote without quorum, faked notice of a hearing, and advised the board to classify my land as passive public access SPAC to justify events on it. It was damning. And it was exactly what I needed. But I didn't go to court. Not yet. I had something better in mind. Something more permanent. That night, I walked the lakefront with a flashlight, pacing off the edge of my deed's boundary, noting every inch. I called in a crew the next day private, fast, lawyer land within 48 hours. A 10-foot privacy fence went up along the entire shoreline perimeter. Steel posts, concrete footing, barbed wire edge on top. And just to make things loud and legal, I posted 6 signs every 20 feet. Private property trespassers will be prosecuted. On the final post, facing the common lot where Karen liked to host her lakefront brunches, I installed a trail camera and a speaker system that would play a loud beep if movement was detected. It didn't take long. By Saturday afternoon, the HOA's precious community lake access had become a steel wall, and Karen, wearing her signature red blouse and white pants, stood shrieking at the fence like she'd been robbed. She called the police. She called code enforcement. She even tried to tear down one of the signs herself, but the moment she crossed the property line, she triggered the speaker and my camera snapped a crystal-clear photo of her in mid-scream. The officer that arrived was someone I'd spoken to just days prior. He reviewed the plat, nodded, and told her she had no case. "This is his land, ma'am, and he's well within his rights." She went pale. But I wasn't done yet. She filed complaints one after another. To zoning, to the HOA, to the county clerk. But none of them could move forward because she'd overplayed her hand. By turning a private property into public space without legal documentation, she had trampled the very policies she claimed to uphold. And now the paper trail I had built, carefully, with time-stamped footage, notarized copies of my deed, a witness list of her past gatherings, and that email thread was airtight. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat. She shifted tactics. Played the victim. "He's cutting the community off from the water," she whined in a local interview. "This lake belongs to everyone." It didn't. It belonged to those who paid for the land, maintained the boundary, and followed the law. But facts didn't matter to people who thought entitlement was the same thing as ownership. So I did something better than argue. I invited the actual community, those who respected property lines, those who quietly supported me, to a private open-house barbecue. I gave them a guided walk along the new fence. I showed them the land plat.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Along the new fence. I showed them the land plat, the photos of Karen's illegal gatherings, the fake notices she had sent. And I played a short clip from the HOA meeting she had held without quorum-recorded audio where she'd laughed and said, "He'll never fight it. He's too busy to care." That recording changed everything. Support shifted. Her own neighbors started questioning her leadership. A petition began circulating, calling for her removal from the board. And I stayed quiet, building in the background. The next blow came from the assessor's office. Using the evidence I'd provided, they launched a formal investigation into the HOA's reclassification of properties. Karen's actions weren't isolated. Turns out, she'd pulled similar stunts before, subtly borrowing parts of adjoining properties to make communal parks, seating areas, and shared access points that boosted HOA control and inflated brand. Property values for her inner circle. One homeowner had lost 15 feet of their garden to a fake greenbelt designation. Another had found a walking path paved across their backyard while they were on vacation. The scam wasn't new. But my case was the one that broke it open. With heat closing in, Karen started slipping. She got hostile at meetings, cursed out board members who no longer backed her, and even tried to intimidate the treasurer who'd forwarded me the emails. That was the final straw. He went public, shared everything. And suddenly, The HOA board was in full collapse, scrambling to retain legal counsel, pleading ignorance, begging the city for delay tactics. But it was too late. I filed a civil lawsuit not just against the HOA, but personally naming Karen as the architect of the fraudulent access scheme. My legal team was merciless. Every invoice, every photo, every permit discrepancy weaponized. When Karen showed up to court the first time, she tried to smile, acting like it was all just a misunderstanding. But the judge had already read our documentation. He didn't smile back. By the second hearing, she was pale, makeup hiding dark circles, flanked by lawyers she clearly couldn't afford. She was drowning, and I made sure no lifeline reached her. Back at the lake, peace returned. The fence stood tall. The path remained closed. And slowly, nature reclaimed the edge she had trampled. Ducks returned. The grass grew back over the tire ruts. I sat on my back deck one evening as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the water. I sipped a cold drink and listened to the stillness, grateful that I'd stood up, fought back, and reminded everyone that ownership wasn't a suggestion. It was a right. Karen would go on to face penalties, fines, and public disgrace. The HOA would be restructured under state oversight. And me? I'd build more fences if I had to. Not out of bitterness, but out of principle. Because when someone gives away what you built, what you bled for, what you own, you don't just take it back. You take everything they used to steal it. Karen's fall didn't happen all at once. It happened like a slow landslide, quiet at first, unnoticed, until the foundation cracked and everything she built began to tumble. The fence I put up didn't just block her from the lake, it exposed her. Because when people saw her screaming at steel and signs and barbed wire, they didn't see a hero of the community anymore. They saw what I had seen all along, a woman obsessed with control, drunk on her own power, and willing to bend the truth until it snapped. And when that snapping sound echoed through the HOA district, more voices started to rise. People who had stayed silent before, afraid to go against her, now began to speak. Homeowners who had once whispered complaints were suddenly forwarding emails, submitting photos, sharing old meeting recordings. One woman came forward with a copy of a lease agreement Karen had used to rent out lakefront picnic space she never had the right to lease. Another revealed Karen had orchestrated AE community fire pit on what turned out to be land she didn't own, bribing a young landscaping company to bulldoze a section of a neighbor's protected garden. What started as a property fight was now a full-blown investigation into HOA corruption, and Karen was at the center of it all. But she didn't go quietly. No. Karen fought back with everything she had. She tried to sue me for malicious obstruction and intentional community disruption. Her lawyers sent cease and desist letters riddled with exaggerated claims that my fence had caused mental anguish, that I was holding the water hostage, but my trail camera violated local visual privacy standards. It was absurd. And it didn't work. Every complaint she filed was thrown out or laughed at. The county had already received my full report and signed it with me. The fence was legal. The footage was admissible. And the land, once again, was undeniably mine. Still, she persisted. She called news crews, spun stories about me being a paranoid extremist, claimed I had fortified the lake and cut off children from nature. But the news anchors weren't buying it anymore, not after they looked into her past. Her record with the HOA wasn't just shady, it was packed with misconduct. Falsified documents, missing funds, ghost invoices for landscaping jobs never done. The deeper the press dug, the worse it looked for her. I remember watching her on a local segment, hair frazzled, voice shaking as she tried to explain how a fence ruined everything. She almost cried. Almost. But the public wasn't sympathetic. Not anymore. Comments rolled in online. People called her out. Victims from other neighborhoods she'd managed began speaking up. And that's when the real reckoning started. One morning, I got a knock at my door from a county investigator. Not a badge-waving sheriff or a clipboard-carrying bureaucrat, but a calm, suited man who introduced himself as a special...
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
A calm, suited man who introduced himself as a special auditor from the Regional Zoning Board. "We've been asked to look into the HOA's financials," he said. "And we'd like your cooperation." I invited him in and showed him everything. The emails, the drone photos, the meeting minutes I managed to get from sympathetic neighbours. I gave him a copy of the audio file, to the one where Karen had casually admitted to bypassing board procedure. He said nothing for a long time as he reviewed the flash drive. Then he looked up and asked a single question. "Has she ever tried to bribe you?" That's when I realised how deep this really went. I told the investigator the truth, that no, Karen had never offered a bribe to me directly. She wasn't stupid enough to try that with someone she knew couldn't be bought. But I also told him what I'd heard from others. A neighbour down the street who mentioned Karen offering favours in exchange for silent votes. A landscaping contractor who hinted at under-the-table bonuses for inflating project costs. The auditor took notes carefully, methodically, as if each word could be fuel for a fire he'd already lit. He didn't ask for my help beyond that one meeting, but I knew from his expression that things were already moving behind the scenes quietly, like the beginning of a storm you only notice when the leaves turn the wrong way. Within a week, Karen vanished from the HOA website. Her profile was removed. Her meeting notes were replaced with generic pending documentation notices. The treasurer she used to manipulate? He resigned, and not quietly he posted a statement on the community forum, revealing that financial decisions were made without board approval and naming Karen directly. Screenshots from his phone surfaced, showing Venmo payments from anonymous accounts and backdated signatures on reimbursement forms. The community, once silent out of fear or convenience, now buzzed like a hive shaken awake. Everyone had a Karen story. Every homeowner had a small injustice. They'd swallowed a fine they didn't deserve, a denied repair, a rule she created on a whim. Now that the door had opened, the flood came through. And I was ready for it. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier anymore. It was a symbol. People began to walk past it like a monument. Some came to ask me how I stood up. Others brought their own complaints and stories, like war survivors comparing scars. An elderly man who'd been fined for putting a flagpole in his yard without visual harmony approval. A young mother whose backyard swing set had been ordered dismantled because play structures over 6 feet require architectural review. All of it petty tyranny under the guise of order, and all of it tied back to Karen. She had ruled like a monarch with a manicured smile and a clipboard. But now she was a fugitive of her own fake kingdom. The lawsuit moved fast after that. My lawyers added 3 new counts of fraud to our original filing, along with a request for injunctive relief to stop Karen from serving in any neighbourhood leadership role again. We subpoenaed HOA emails, bank accounts, meeting logs, and contractor payment histories. Karen's attorneys tried to stall, but the judge wasn't having it. Every delay tactic was smacked down. Every protest met with more evidence. When her deposition day came, she showed up tired and defeated, her makeup layered too thick to hide the weight on her face. She tried to stay calm, but we had her pinned. And then came the moment that shattered her when my attorney presented a bank statement showing that over $37,000 in HOA funds had been rerouted through a maintenance contractor she balm, owned under a different name. The room went dead silent. She stammered, denied, blamed clerical errors. But we had the receipts. Literally. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. The headline was already written, "Fence owner reveals financial fraud in explosive HOA trial." That's when Karen snapped. Karen snapped in a way I hadn't expected. Not in the...
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Karen snapped in a way I hadn't expected, not in the courtroom, not even in front of the press, but in the way her entire persona unraveled the moment the illusion of control was gone. Once her financial fraud was exposed, once the media began circulating her mugshot with the headline, "HOA Queen faces criminal charges," she stopped pretending. She stopped dressing the part, stopped combing her hair into that neat helmet of fake confidence. The woman who once strutted down my lakefront in white slacks and sunglasses now shuffled into hearings in court-issued greys, looking smaller than I ever imagined she could. Her lawyers tried to negotiate a deal, partial restitution, in exchange for avoiding jail time, but the DA wasn't having it. The paper trail we provided, the mounting pressure from community complaints, and the visibility of the case made it impossible to sweep under the rug. She wasn't just another corrupt official anymore, she had become a symbol. And the people wanted justice. The judge ordered a full audit of the HOA's financials over the last 5 years. It uncovered an empire of quiet theft, maintenance fees diverted to shell companies, construction contracts awarded to her brother-in-law, fines waived for selective friends in exchange for campaign support. In the end, 12 other properties were implicated in her schemes. Homeowners who had been quietly manipulated out of their land, reassessed unfairly, or fined until they sold under pressure. One man had lost his family's lake cabin over a late fee that Karen had invented. Another had been cited for a deck expansion that didn't even exist, just an excuse to levy penalties. It wasn't just corruption. It was a system. And it was hers. She was sentenced to 6 years in state prison with no possibility of parole, fined $250,000 in restitution to victims, and barred from holding any administrative role. Related to real estate or property management for life. The HOA was placed under temporary control by a neutral oversight board, their power gutted until a full re-election could occur. Several board members resigned in shame. Some were under investigation. And me? I stood on my back porch, the fence still firm behind me, the lake glistening in the summer light, watching as crews finally tore down the illegal community launch dock Karen had installed. My dock remained privately built, legally protected, and now more symbolic than ever. But what struck me most wasn't the legal win, or the money I recovered, or even the satisfaction of seeing Karen face consequences. It was what happened in the months after, when the lake returned to what it had been before her shadow stretched over it. The birds came back. The noise died down. The land healed. And so did I. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved. Some asked for advice on how to protect their own property. One man, a quiet Vietnam veteran who lived 3 houses down, simply placed a hand on my shoulder one day and said, "You fought back. For all of us." And I realized something then. This wasn't just about my fence. It was about drawing a line not in wood or wire, but in principle. Between what's right and what's easy. Between ownership and abuse. Between silence and resistance. I kept the trail cameras up. Not because I feared new threats, but because I respected the land too much to let it be stolen again. I kept copies of the court documents. I framed the judge's rooming. And I never, not once, took down the no trespassing signs. Not out of spite, but out of remembrance. Because some battles aren't about revenge. They're about making sure no one else has to fight the same one after you're gone. And on that quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the water rippled in peace, I sat on my deck, lifted a glass to the silence, and finally let go. The fence had done its job. So had I.